The scream tore through the toxic air like a jagged blade, rising above the caustic storm's howl. Kalen jerked upright in his makeshift cot, disorientation quickly giving way to practiced alertness. His sensors had never registered anything like this on Xylos. This abandoned mining moon wasn't supposed to have any sentient life forms besides himself. That had been the entire point of choosing it. Kalen ran a hand through his unkempt hair, staring at the readout on his jury-rigged monitoring system. A non-human life sign, pulsing weakly about 2 kilometers northeast in one of the abandoned excavation tunnels. And then that scream, a sound of such primal agony that it had penetrated even the howling acid storm outside. His first instinct was to ignore it. Survival on Xylos meant minding your own business. That's what experience had taught him. That's what had kept him alive for the past 18 months in this caustic wasteland after the incident that had forced him into exile. After his betrayal had cost so many lives. The scream came again, weaker this time, but somehow more desperate. It wasn't like any creature native to Xylos, not the scuttling hexapods that survived in the cracks of the moon's crust, nor the acid-resistant fungi that occasionally bloomed during the rare dry periods. This was someone else. Damn it, Kalen muttered, already moving toward his environmental hazard suit hanging on its rack near the airlock. His muscles moved before his mind had fully committed, muscle memory from a life he'd tried to leave behind. The life of someone who once cared. The suit was a patchwork of materials, reinforced in places where the corrosive rains had eaten through the original fabric. It wasn't pretty, but it kept him alive. He checked the seals meticulously. A single leak could mean a slow, excruciating death before checking his antiquated pulse pistol. The weapon was a relic, but he'd maintained it with obsessive care. Stepping into the airlock, Kalen took a deep breath of the filtered air inside his helmet. The outside atmospheric scanners showed the storm was intensifying. Perfect timing. As the outer door slid open with a reluctant groan, he stepped into hell. The acid rain hammered against his suit, each droplet a potential death sentence if it found a weak spot. Through the storm's veil, he could barely make out the hulking silhouettes of abandoned mining equipment, sentinels of a forgotten industry. The tracking device in his hand beeped steadily, guiding him northeast. The path took him through a treacherous maze of collapsed tunnels and toxic mud fields. The terrain was unpredictable. What had been solid ground yesterday could be a sinkhole today, as the acid slowly dissolved the moon's unstable crust. Kalen moved carefully, each step calculated, fighting not only the storm but his own reluctance. Why was he doing this? Every instinct forged in his years as a corporate security specialist screamed that this was a mistake. Involvement meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant danger. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, paid for it with the lives of everyone who had ever trusted him. Yet he pressed on, following the signal as it grew stronger, following that terrible scream that refused to leave his mind. After nearly an hour of struggling through the hostile landscape, Kalen approached a partially collapsed tunnel entrance. His device showed the life sign was just inside. He drew his pistol and activated the suit's external lights, piercing the darkness ahead. The tunnel was unstable, support beams groaning under the pressure of the collapsing ceiling. Water, or something closer to diluted acid, dripped steadily from cracks overhead, eating small divots into the stone floor. Kalen advanced cautiously, stepping over debris, ducking under hanging cables. That's when he saw her. She was caught in some kind of energy trap, a crude but effective device that buzzed with raw power. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was meant to incapacitate, to capture, to keep something valuable alive, but helpless. And what it had caught was unlike anything Kalen had ever seen. She was humanoid in overall shape, but with a graceful avian appearance. Her body covered in feathers that might once have been vibrant, but now hung dull and matted. One wing, a beautiful appendage that would likely span 2 meters when extended, was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. The other was pulled tight against her body. Her face had both human and bird-like features. Large, expressive eyes now wide with pain and fear, a slightly elongated face ending in what wasn't quite a beak, but wasn't quite human lips either. Most striking were the bioluminescent patterns visible beneath her feathers, pulsing faintly, weakly, in rhythm with what must be her heartbeat. When she saw Kaelin, she let out a defensive hiss, trying to make herself look larger despite her obvious weakness. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, tracked his every movement. "Easy," Kaelin said, though he wasn't sure she could understand him. He holstered his pistol slowly, making the gesture as clear as possible. "I'm not going to hurt you." He examined the trap carefully. It was sophisticated, far more advanced than anything that should have been left behind on this abandoned moon. Someone had placed it here deliberately. Recently, the avian being watched him with growing panic as he approached the trap's control mechanism. She made a weak attempt to move away, but the energy field held her firmly. "I need to deactivate this," Kaelin explained, keeping his voice low and even. "It might hurt when the field drops." "I'm sorry." He worked methodically, trying to bypass the security protocols without triggering any fail-safes. Whoever had designed this trap was a professional, but then, so had Kaelin been in another life. It took several tense minutes, but finally he found the primary circuit and carefully disabled it. The energy field flickered and died with a descending whine. The avian being collapsed immediately, unable to support her own weight. Kaelin moved forward to catch her, but she recoiled from his touch, letting out a pained chirp. "Understand," he said, backing away slightly, "but that storm out there is getting worse. You won't survive in it, especially not injured." She stared at him, her gaze intense despite her weakness. There was intelligence there, clear and unmistakable, and suspicion, and fear. "I have shelter," Kaelin continued. "Medical supplies. Not much, but better than staying here." He gestured to her broken wing. "That needs treatment." The avian being looked toward the tunnel entrance, where the acid rain was now falling so heavily it created a curtain of deadly droplets. She looked back at Kaelin, then at her wing. Finally, with what seemed enormous effort, she extended her uninjured arm toward him. Kaelin approached slowly, telegraphing his movements. When he finally reached her, he could see the full extent of her injuries. Not just the broken wing, but older wounds, partially healed. Someone had hurt her repeatedly, and she was exhausted, probably starving. As gently as he could, Kaelin lifted her. She was surprisingly light, her bones having the hollow structure associated with avian species. But she was still substantial, still real in his arms, a warm, living being who trembled slightly against him. The journey back to his shelter was a nightmare. The storm had intensified, visibility dropping to almost nothing. The avian being had lapsed into unconsciousness, which was probably a mercy given the jostling travel through the hostile terrain. Twice Kaelin nearly fell into newly formed sinkholes, only his years of training keeping them both from a caustic grave. By the time he reached his shelter, a repurposed miner's housing unit reinforced with scavenged materials, his suit was showing warning signs of integrity failure on the left shoulder and right knee. 10 more minutes, and the acid would have eaten through. Inside the airlock, Kaelin carefully placed the avian being on the decontamination pad before beginning the cleansing sequence for his suit. Once the outer layer of acid had been neutralized, he removed the helmet and finally allowed himself a deep breath of unfiltered air. The inner door slid open, revealing his Spartan living space. It wasn't much, a main room that served as kitchen, living area, and workspace, plus a small sleeping alcove and a rudimentary bathroom. Everything was functional, nothing was comfortable. Comfort had never been the point. Kaelin carried his unconscious visitor to the room's single cot and gently laid her down. Now, in the shelter's harsh lighting, he could see her more clearly. Her feathers, what he had first taken as a uniform dull gray, actually retained faint hints of blue and gold beneath the grime. The bioluminescent patterns under her skin pulsed irregularly, concentrated along her neck, chest, and the undersides of her wings. Most pressing was the broken wing. Kaelin was no medic, but he'd had basic field training. Still, avian anatomy was far outside his expertise. He would have to improvise. He gathered his limited medical supplies, a universal first aid kit he'd salvaged from an abandoned med station, supplemented with items he'd carefully accumulated during his time on Xylos. As he cleaned her wounds with sterile solution, the avian being began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, instantly alert and afraid. "You're safe," Kalen said quickly, backing away to give her space. "I'm treating your injuries. The wing is broken. I need to set it." She looked around the shelter, assessing exits, threats, advantages. Even injured and disoriented, she had the mindset of someone hunted. Kalen recognized it all too well. He gestured to the water purifier. "Drink? Food?" He held up a packet of nutrient powder, tasteless but containing the basic requirements for most humanoid metabolisms. The avian being looked at the water with clear longing, but made no move toward it. Kalen filled a cup and placed it within her reach, then stepped back again. After a moment's hesitation, she took it with her uninjured arm and drank deeply. "The wing," Kalen said again, mimicking a splinting motion. "I can help, but it will hurt." She stared at him for a long moment before finally extending her broken wings slightly. Permission, or at least acceptance of necessity. The next hour was difficult for them both. Setting the wing with improvised materials was a challenge, and Kalen could tell he was causing pain despite his best efforts to be gentle. The avian being made no sound, but her luminescent patterns flared brightly during the worst moments, and her breathing became rapid and shallow. When he finally finished securing the makeshift splint, Kalen offered her the nutrient powder mixed with water. She accepted it warily, but consumed it quickly once she'd tasted it. Exhaustion was clearly overtaking her again. "Rest," Kalen said, pointing to the cot. "You're safe here." He moved to the opposite side of the room, settling himself on the floor with his back against the wall, where she could see him clearly. It was a deliberate choice. He wanted her to know he wasn't going to approach while she slept. The avian being watched him with those intelligent eyes until they finally closed, her body surrendering to the need for recovery. Kalen remained awake, vigilant, as the storm raged outside and memories he tried to bury clawed their way back to the surface of his mind. Days passed, marked by the shelter's artificial lighting cycle rather than any natural rhythm. The storm eventually subsided, but Kalen didn't venture out. Instead, he maintained a careful routine, tending to his visitors' needs while giving her space, never demanding interaction. The avian being, whom he still hadn't named, even in his thoughts, was healing gradually. The broken wing remained immobilized in its splint, but her other injuries were improving. She was eating more, sleeping less, and watching. Always watching. Kalen observed too. He noted how her feathers shifted slightly to reflect her mood, how the bioluminescent patterns brightened when she was alert and dimmed when she was relaxed. He began to recognize patterns in her movements, preferences in her habits. He started leaving simple drawings on scraps of material, basic shapes, representations of objects in the shelter. Sometimes he'd return to find them rearranged or modified. She was communicating in her way, testing, exploring. On the 7th day, she made a sound that wasn't related to pain or fear. A soft chirp, almost like a question. She pointed at the tablet Kalen sometimes used to monitor his perimeter sensors. Kalen brought it to her, placing it on the cot beside her. She touched it hesitantly, then began drawing on its surface with her talon-like fingers, crude symbols, disconnected images. A story began to take shape. Pursuit, capture attempts, escape, the trap. "Someone's hunting you," Kalen said quietly. She touched her chest, then drew more symbols. Magnificent structures floating among stars, beings similar to herself with elaborate wing patterns, then darker figures with weapons. Sky reavers, she managed in a halting, accented approximation of human speech. It clearly took great effort. Hunt. Trade. Rare ones. Kalen felt a chill. He knew of such operations. Corporate sanctioned in some systems, illegal in others, but always profitable. Exotic beings captured for private collections or specialized labor. He'd never been directly involved in such trafficking, But he'd look the other way when his employers had connections to it. Just another compromise in a career built on them. "You came to Xylos to escape," he said. She nodded, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass the desolate moon. "No one here. Safe place." Her face, so alien yet somehow expressive, darkened. They followed. "The trap," Kalen said. "Advanced. Not mining equipment." She nodded again, pointing outside. "More come." The implication was clear. The trap had been set by hunters. Hunters who would return for their prize. "How many?" Kalen asked. She held up 4 taloned fingers. "For hunters. Professional exotic species traffickers. On his moon. Looking for the being he'd rescued." "I know about being hunted," Kalen said after a long silence. He didn't elaborate. Didn't explain how he'd been a corporate loyalty enforcer until discovering his employers were developing biological weapons for deployment against civilian populations. How he'd tried to expose them. How they'd framed him for the very atrocity he'd tried to prevent. How everyone who'd helped him had paid with their lives. How he'd barely escaped to this forgotten corner of space, a man officially dead, but hunted still if his identity were ever discovered. He didn't say any of this, but something in his tone must have conveyed the weight of it. The avian being, no, he couldn't keep thinking of her that way, looked at him with new understanding. "Name?" she asked, touching her chest, then pointing at him. "Kalen," he replied. Then, gesturing to her, "And you?" She made a sound unlike anything a human throat could produce, melodic, multi-toned. "Lyra," she simplified after seeing his inability to reproduce the sound. "Lyra," Kalen repeated, nodding. "We need to strengthen the shelter's defenses and monitor the perimeter more carefully." He showed her the basics of operating the sensor array, how to recognize different signal types, how to distinguish between environmental anomalies and potential threats. Lyra proved a quick study, her nimble fingers soon navigating the system with ease. Kalen reinforced the shelter's outer locks, set additional alarms, and inventoried his limited weapons. The pistol, a few improvised explosives fashioned for mining charges, some tools that could serve as weapons in close quarters. Not much against 4 professional hunters, presumably well-equipped. The relative peace of the past days gave way to a growing tension. Every alert from the perimeter sensors, even false alarms triggered by Xylos' unstable geology, sent them both into high alert. Kalen slept in short intervals, always with the pistol within reach. Lyra's bioluminescent patterns stayed brightened in a constant state of readiness, her healing wing held protectively close. They were waiting for the inevitable. It came sooner than expected. The first warning was subtle, a momentary disruption in the outermost sensor grid. It could have been a system glitch or environmental interference. But 3 minutes later, a second grid showed the same disruption pattern. Too precise to be coincidence. "They're here," Kalen said, already moving to the monitoring station. Using some kind of stealth tech to approach, but not perfect. The displays showed faint, intermittent signals moving methodically through the toxic landscape surrounding the shelter, for distinct patterns spreading out to surround them. "They know you're here," Kalen said. "This is a coordinated containment approach." Lyra's feathers flattened against her body, her luminescence dimming to almost nothing, an instinctive response to danger. "No escape," she whispered. Kalen was about to agree when Lyra suddenly moved to the shelter's main display, bringing up the geological survey maps he'd salvaged from the mining company's abandoned database. She pointed to an area approximately 2 kilometers south of their position. "Thermal vents," she said. "Hidden tunnels. Miners used. Not on maps." Kalen stared at her. "How do you know this?" "Watched. Before trap." Her eyes met his. "Way out." Kalen considered their options rapidly. The shelter was defensible but not impregnable. Eventually, the hunters would breach it. And if they were professional enough to use advanced stealth tech, they'd have equipment to deal with the moon's hostile environment for extended periods. "We'll need supplies," he said, making the decision. "Minimal. And weapons." He moved to a storage locker, removing a backpack and quickly filling it with essentials: water purification tabs, nutrient bars, medical basics. Then he added the pulse pistol and the improvised explosives. "Your wing," he said, looking at Lyra with concern. "Can you move well enough?" She extended her uninjured wings slightly, adjusting her balance. "Yes. Fast." She pointed to the splinted wing. "This not fly, but run. Climb." Kalen nodded, then moved to the shelter's central control panel. "I'm going to set the defense grid to random activation. It won't stop them, but it might slow them down, make them think we're still here while we escape." As he worked, a proximity alarm shrilled. The innermost perimeter had been breached. The hunters were closing in. "Time's up," Kalen muttered, slinging the backpack over his shoulder. "We leave now." Through the secondary maintenance shaft. The shaft in question was barely wide enough for a human adult, an emergency exit of sorts, leading to a service tunnel that connected to the broader mining complex. Kalen had explored it only partially, finding it collapsed about half a kilometer in. But now Lyra was suggesting it might connect to these hidden thermal vent tunnels. Lyra went first, her slender form easily navigating the narrow passage. Kalen followed, fighting a lifetime of trained caution that screamed against entering such a confined space with limited exit options. But staying meant capture, or worse. They had barely closed the hidden access panel behind them when they heard the shelter's outer airlock being breached. Muffled, but unmistakable, the sound of professional infiltration. The maintenance shaft led them into darkness, lit only by Kalen's portable light and the faint glow of Lyra's bioluminescence, which she seemed able to dim at will. They moved as quickly as possible through the cramped tunnel, ducking under hanging cables and squeezing past protruding pipes. "How far to these thermal vents?" Kalen whispered as they paused at a junction. Lyra pointed to the right-hand passage. "Down, then south. Listen for steam." The tunnel descended at a steep angle, forcing them to brace against the walls to avoid sliding uncontrolled into unknown dangers below. The air grew warmer, humid, a stark change from the artificial environment of the shelter or the caustic atmosphere outside. Behind them, distantly, came sounds of pursuit. The hunters had discovered their escape route. Kalen cursed under his breath. "They're tracking us somehow." Lyra touched her splinted wing, her expression grim. "Trap. Put something in me." A tracking device, implanted when she was briefly caught. "Of course. Standard procedure for valuable quarry." "We need to move faster," Kalen said. "Lead the way." They pushed on through increasingly warmer tunnels. Soon they could hear the hiss of steam venting from cracks in the walls. The thermal activity that had originally attracted the mining operation to this desolate moon. The tunnels here showed less evidence of human modification. These were natural formations, expanded and reinforced in places, but largely left to their wild state. Lyra moved with growing confidence, following some sense Kalen couldn't share. Perhaps it was heightened hearing detecting subtle air currents, or sensitivity to temperature gradients, or something entirely unique to her species. Whatever it was, she navigated the labyrinthine passages without hesitation. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Their hunters were gaining ground. Kalen checked his pistol. 6 shots remaining. Not enough. "How much farther?" he asked as they emerged into a slightly larger cavern where multiple tunnels converged. Lyra pointed to a passage directly ahead. "Main vent chamber." Then, way out, as they started toward it, a searing bolt of energy struck the wall beside them, sending superheated rock fragments flying. Kalen shoved Lyra to the ground, covering her with his body as more shots followed. "Go!" he shouted, rolling away and firing his pistol toward the source of the attack. "I'll hold them off." Lyra hesitated only a moment before darting toward the passage she'd indicated. Kalen fired again, twice, forcing their pursuers to take cover momentarily. He caught glimpses of them, humanoid figures in advanced environmental suits, armed with energy weapons far superior to his outdated pistol. He backed away, firing his remaining shots carefully, making each one count. When the pistol was empty, he drew one of the improvised explosives, primed it, and hurled it toward the narrowest part of the tunnel their pursuers would need to navigate. The blast shook the cavern, bringing down part of the ceiling in a controlled cave-in. It wouldn't stop them for long, but it might by precious minutes. Kalen turned and ran after Lyra, finding her waiting just beyond the entrance to what must be the main vent chamber. It was an enormous natural cavern, at least 30 meters high, illuminated by the eerie red-orange glow of exposed magma flows far below. Narrow stone bridges, some natural, some artificially reinforced, crisscrossed the open space, connecting to various tunnel openings on the far side. Steam billowed up from the depths, occasionally obscuring visibility completely. "Which way?" Kalen asked. Lyra pointed to a tunnel opening almost directly opposite their position, accessible via one of the narrower stone bridges. "There, leads to surface. Old emergency exit." They started across the nearest bridge, moving carefully on the slick surface. Below them, the magma bubbled and spat, a deadly reminder of Xylos's unstable geology. They were halfway across when Kalen heard the distinctive whine of energy weapons powering up. He spun around to see two hunters emerging from the tunnel behind them, weapons raised. "Down!" he shouted, pulling Lyra to the bridge's surface as energy bolts sizzled through the air where they'd been standing. Trapped on the exposed bridge, they had nowhere to hide. Kalen reached for another improvised explosive, but before he could deploy it, movement from another tunnel entrance caught his attention. The other two hunters had circled around somehow, emerging on the far side of the chamber. They were cut off. "Surrender the specimen," a mechanically filtered voice called out. One of the hunters, speaking through an environmental suit's communication system. "You are surrounded. There is no escape." Kalen looked at Lyra, saw the terror in her eyes. Her broken wing, her tired body. All she'd endured to reach this moment. All she'd survived. "I have mining charges," he called back. "Enough to bring this whole chamber down. Back off, or none of us leaves here alive." A pause. Then, "The specimen is valuable. You're not." Final warning. Kalen reached into the backpack, removing the remaining explosives. "Lyra," he whispered, "when I say run, go for that tunnel you pointed out. Don't stop, don't look back." "Together," she insisted, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Someone has to trigger the charges after you're clear," Kalen said. "It's the only way." Her luminescent patterns flared brightly. "No, find another way." Kalen started to argue, but stopped when he saw movement from the hunters on the far side. They were advancing onto another bridge, trying to reach a better firing position. He had seconds to decide. "The timing would have to be perfect," he said quickly. "We need to reach the tunnel entrance just as the charges detonated." Lyra nodded, understanding immediately. "Set now. Run together." Kalen activated the explosive charges, setting them for a 30-second delay. Barely enough time to reach the tunnel if they moved fast. He placed them at the center of the bridge, where the structure was weakest. "Now!" he shouted, grabbing Lyra's hand as they sprinted toward the far side of the chamber. Energy bolts lanced around them, the hunters realizing something was happening. One shot struck dangerously close to Lyra's feet, nearly sending her over the edge. She stumbled, her injured wing throwing off her balance. In that moment, one of the hunters fired a precision shot that would have hit her directly, except Lyra suddenly twisted aside, deliberately drawing fire away from Kalen, who was carrying the backpack with the last of their supplies. The bolt grazed her instead, scorching feathers and flesh. She cried out, but kept moving. They were almost to the tunnel entrance when the lead hunter somehow circled ahead, emerging from a side passage to block their path. He raised his weapon, aiming directly at Kalen. Lyra, despite her fresh injury, launched herself at the hunter with unexpected speed, her talons slashing at the faceplate of his environmental suit. It wasn't enough to penetrate, but the sudden attack threw off his aim. His shot went wide, striking the rock wall instead. Kalen tackled him bodily, using his greater mass to knock the hunter off balance. They grappled briefly on the edge of the stone platform, before Kalen managed to shove the hunter away. "Lyra, go!" he shouted, seeing she had a clear path to the tunnel now. The explosive charges detonated with a thunderous roar, sending shockwaves through the entire chamber. The bridge they had crossed began to collapse, taking one of the pursuing hunters with it into the magma below. The remaining hunters scrambled for stable ground as more of the chamber's structures began to fail, weakened by the strategic placement of the explosives. Kalen grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her into the tunnel just as a massive section of the cavern ceiling came crashing down behind them, sealing off the entrance in a pile of rubble and dust. They kept running, navigating by touch and the faint glow of Lyra's bioluminescence, until they were certain no pursuit was possible. Finally, gasping for breath, they collapsed against the tunnel wall. "You're hurt," Kalen said, noticing the energy weapon burn on Lyra's side. "You also," she replied, pointing to a gash on his forehead he hadn't even felt, adrenaline masking the pain. They tended to each other's wounds with the limited medical supplies from the backpack. The silence between them was comfortable now, the ease of those who had faced death together and chosen each other over self-preservation. "Will they follow?" Lyra asked eventually. Kalen considered. "If any survive, they'll try. But the collapse bought us time. And their tracking device." Lyra touched her injured side where the energy bolt had struck. "Gone. Burned out. A piece of luck in the chaos." The high-energy weapon had likely fried the implanted tracker. "Then we need to keep moving," Kalen said. "Find that emergency exit you mentioned." The tunnel continued upward, gradually becoming steeper. In places they had to climb rather than walk, with Kalen helping Lyra navigate the most difficult sections, mindful of her injuries and splinted wing. The air grew cooler, drier. They were approaching the surface. After what felt like hours of arduous progress, they came to a heavy metal hatch set into the tunnel ceiling. An emergency escape route, just as Lyra had said. Kalen struggled with the ancient mechanism, decades of disuse having nearly welded it shut. Finally, with Lyra adding her strength to his, the hatch grudgingly gave way. Clean, or at least cleaner, air rushed in from above. They emerged onto the surface of Xylos. Not the familiar toxic wasteland near Kalen's shelter, but a different region. The corrosive storms were less severe here, the landscape less scarred by mining operations. The horizon stretched out beneath an alien sky, streaked with the gas giant that Xylos orbited. They were alive, together, against all odds. Kalen helped Lyra climb the rest of the way out of the tunnel, then secured the hatch behind them. They were ragged, exhausted, wounded, but free. They found shelter in a shallow cave and treated their injuries more thoroughly. Lyra's burn side would heal cleanly with proper care. Kalen's head wound was superficial despite the bleeding. The wing would take longer, but it too would mend. As night fell on this slightly more hospitable face of Xylos, they sat together at the cave entrance, watching the stars emerge. "What now?" Lyra asked softly. Kalen had been asking himself the same question. He'd been hiding on Xylos, waiting to die slowly, waiting to be forgotten. But now, "There's an abandoned transport vessel about 20 kilometers from here," he said. "I found it during my first months here, but never had reason to repair it. With some work, it might fly again." Lyra's luminescent patterns brightened with hope. "Leave Xylos. Leave Xylos," Kalen confirmed. Together, Lyra's uninjured wing extended slightly, the edge of it brushing against Kalen's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that needed no translation. "The Sky Reavers will not stop hunting," she said. "And your enemies will always be looking," Kalen finished. "But we'll be together, not running away anymore, but towards something." Lyra's hand found his in the darkness, her taloned fingers intertwining with his human ones. Different but fitting together nonetheless. "Towards something," she repeated, looking up at the stars with new determination. In that moment, on that desolate moon, something new had been forged in the fire of their shared ordeal. Not just survival, but the promise of more. Kalen had found redemption not in hiding from his past, but in protecting another's future. Lyra had found safety and trust where she had expected only death. They weren't exiles anymore. They were survivors, building something new from the ashes of what had been. As dawn broke over Xylos's scarred horizon, They gathered their few possessions and began walking toward the abandoned transport vessel. Their first step toward a future neither had dared imagine before finding each other. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, under new skies, among new stars.